This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today we're continuing with my Theros Beyond Death limited set review. We've already looked at white and blue. Today we're looking at black. We'll be looking at red and green the next few days, and so on. In these videos, I'm talking about all the cards of a particular color, black in this case, for Theros Beyond Death, specifically about how good they're going to be in the new limited format, which means draft or sealed. These are my early impressions about the cards before actually having played with any of them. Alright, let's look at our first black card. First, we have Agonizing Remorse, which for one generic in a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, or a card from their graveyard, exile that card, you lose 1 life. Discard spells aren't as good in limited as they are in constructed, but at least this one is only 2 mana and can hit anything but lands. The reason they tend not to be great in limited is because they have no immediate impact on the board, something very important in limited, and they also tend to get a little worse as the game goes on. Try running a discard spell in your deck and drawing it when you and your opponent are both in top deck mode, and you'll know what I mean. It's an awful feeling. People just don't hold on to cards as much in limited as in constructed, and sure, it can go after a card in the graveyard in a worst case scenario, but I'm still not super impressed with this. Overall, I think like most discard spells in limited, I don't really think I want to be mainboarding this. It's probably a D+ if you have to, meaning, as a 23rd, 24th card, if you're short on playables, you could do worse, but it's not very good. However, it is a nice sideboard card against people who hold on to a lot of cards and or have graveyard shenanigans, and I'm going to say it's a C in those situations. Next up, we have Ephemia, the Cacophony. For one generic and a black, it's a 2/1 legendary enchantment creature Harpy at rare. It's got flying, and it says at the beginning of your end step, you may exile an enchantment card from your graveyard. If you do, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. I really like the design here. This might be my favorite card in the set. It's up there, certainly. A 2-mana 2/1 flyer is usually a C+ or so in limited. That is just a great 2-drop whose evasive damage can add up early in the beginning parts of the game, but Ephemia comes with the massive upside of turning enchantments in your graveyard into 2/2 zombies every turn, too. In a lot of sets, actually getting enchantments in your graveyard might be a huge ask, but it's not here. There are a critical mass of enchantments in this set, so most decks will have plenty, especially because of enchantment creatures. Plus, there are lots of ways to mill yourself, especially in black, blue, and green, and that makes it even more likely you can make a few zombies. Now, making a whole zombie army is probably wishful thinking, but if you can even just get the 2-mana 2/1 flyer in a single 2/2 zombie for that 2-mana investment, you are doing an absolutely incredible job. I think the reasonable floor and fairly high ceiling means Ephemia is going to be worth first picking a decent chunk of the time. I'm giving this Harpy a B. Next up, we have Aspect of Lamprey, which for 3 generic and a black is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature you control. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards 2 cards, and enchanted creature has lifelink. This card is sort of like 2 different kinds of cards I never like stapled together. Mind Rot I don't like a whole lot, and I also don't like auras that don't really add any stats to creatures most of the time. But I do think both of them combining together is better, obviously, than either of them would be alone. And in general, as we've seen all week, there's lots of auras in this set that are playable, and that's because they do things that keep you from getting 2-for-1. Aspect of Lamprey does it by mind rotting the opponent. Keep in mind, like with all auras, that if your opponent kills your creature in response to casting this, you still get 2-for-1. But if the aspect resolves, you're going to be at least breaking even with your opponent. Lifelink is also a nice keyword ability. It can really make it impossible for opponents to race you if you put it on the right creature, so that's all the positive stuff. Now for the negative. Mind Rot is usually a D+. This is because discard effects frequently get worse the longer a game goes on, as we said earlier, and sometimes to the point that a discard spell does absolutely nothing. Now, unlike Mind Rot, Aspect of Lamprey does kind of impact the board, but for it to impact it in any meaningful way, you basically already need a good creature in play. So while I think this will make the cut sometimes, I think it will also be cut pretty frequently. I'm giving it a C-. Next, we have Blight Breath Catablepus, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 3/2 beast at common, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -X until end of turn, where X is your devotion to black. So, Devotion, a mechanic in this set that we're seeing return from the original Theros. Basically, you count the number of black mana symbols on your permanents, and that's what your Devotion to black is. In general, I'm a big fan of creatures like this. Necrotals, creatures who can come down and kill something. When they can do that, they are frequently 2-for-1s, and you want as many of those as you can get in limited. Now, this guy is a whopping 6 mana for only a 3-2, but even in a fail case, it's a 6 mana 3-2 that gives the opponent's creature -2/-2. It's not awesome, but it would probably be like a D or D+. Obviously, the ceiling on this card is much higher, as your Devotion will usually be more than just the 2 he brings to the table. I do think the mana cost and lack of an efficient body for the cost holds this back some. You just won't want that many 6-drops, but I feel like I will always want the first copy of this in black decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Cling to Dust, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon instant, and it says exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you gain 3 life, otherwise you draw a card. It also has Escape, a mechanic in this set that lets you pay a mana cost and exile some cards from your library to cast a card from the graveyard, and in this case you pay 3 generic and a black and you exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. So, the large number of graveyard synergies in this set mean that Cling to Dust is going to be main boardable more frequently. So, the large number of graveyard synergies in this set probably means that Cling to Dust is going to be worth mainboarding some of the time. I think a lot of the time going after a non-creature is going to be ideal with it, since drawing a card is considerably better than gaining life, but sometimes you do have to go after a scary creature who has Escape or something like that. The fact you potentially get 2 chances with this or more is nice too, because it makes it more likely you can net a card with it all of those times. And hey, if you're always drawing a card with this, you're at least going to be getting a 2-for-1 and maybe even more, while also tampering with your opponent's graveyard. However, we have to acknowledge how mediocre this is in a situation where you're going after creatures, because in those cases it's not going to be very impressive. I think this is a reasonable-ish 23rd or 24th card main board, but it's pretty easy to cut. I think it's a D+ main board, but probably a C+ as a sideboard card. Against opponents who are really doing graveyard things, this can really derail their plans. Next up, we have Discordant Piper, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2-1 zombie satyr. It's common, and when it dies, you create a 0-1 white goat creature token. So 2 mana 2-1s are pretty close to unplayable in limited these days, a D at best. But this isn't vanilla. It makes a 0-1 goat when it dies. Making an additional body is always a nice upgrade, even if the body is as irrelevant as a 0-1 goat. That token is still going to be a useful resource, either because you can use it to chump block, or maybe you can sacrifice it to something for value. So how much does that goat help upgrade Discordant Piper? A little bit. It goes from being a D to getting into the C range, though for now, I do think that it's only a C-. If it turns out sacrificing stuff is a big deal in this set, and Black-Red is interested in doing that, it could end up going up. Next, we have Drag to the Underworld, which for 2 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant. It says it costs X less to cast, where X is your devotion to black, and it just says destroy target creature. This is premium removal, one of the best uncommons in the set. 4 mana to kill anything at instant speed is probably a B-. Obviously, 3 mana is Murder, a very powerful removal spell we have seen in any format, and this has the potential to only cost 2 black mana, and it's not exactly far-fetched. Now, it does matter that this doesn't exile stuff, since Escape puts extra value on cards going to the graveyard, but I think this is so efficient that it is really nitpicky to point that out. I think this is one of the best uncommons in the set, as I said, and I'm giving it a B+. You'll first pick it over the vast majority of rares and mythics in this format. Next up, we have Eat to Extinction, which for 3 generic and a black is a rare instant. It says exile target creature or planeswalker. Look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard. So we've looked at back-to-back 4 mana cards that can instant speed kill creatures. 4 mana to kill something at instant speed, like I said, is usually enough for a B-, and this adds a couple of extra things to the mix, namely the ability to exile stuff, which really matters in this format, and the fact that it also lets you surveil, essentially. You get to improve your draw and or load up your graveyard, both of which are good things to do. The fact it only has 1 black in its cost is nice too, since it means splashing it won't be that hard. Obviously, the ability to kill planeswalkers is nice, but won't come up very often in this format. I think overall, Eat to Extinction is also a B+. The real question is whether you'd rather have Drag to the Underworld or Eat to Extinction, like if you actually have them in a pack together, and that'll be an interesting choice. Right now, I think I would lean towards Eat to Extinction just because exiling looks so good in this format. Next up, we have Elspeth's Nightmare, which for 2 generic and a black is an enchantment saga at uncommon. The first chapter, which means it does it right away when it comes down, says destroy target creature an opponent controls with power 2 or less. The second chapter, you get another one of these chapters every time after your draw step. So the second chapter says target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. And chapter 3 says exile target opponent's graveyard. This seems pretty solid to me. How good it will be sort of depends on how often you can hit a card with both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Both effects on it are a little bit restrictive. While there won't always be a 2 power or less creature on the battlefield, it seems like most of the time that part will hit something. Chapter 2's discard effect is the one that worries me a little bit more, since it can only hit non-creatures and non-lands, so that means it's going to whiff a decent chunk of the time, though with a lot of enchantments in this format, maybe it'll hit more often than I think. Then Chapter 3, taking out the opponent's graveyard entirely, is definitely useful in this format. However, since this is a saga, your opponent knows it's coming and can extract as much value from their graveyard as they need to while you wait for Chapter 3. Too often, I think this will be a 3-mana removal spell that kills only small creatures, and then a couple of turns later, a card that exiles their graveyard. The second chapter just seems like it's going to miss a decent chunk of the time, and I think that holds this back. I think it's just a C. Next up, we have Enemy of Enlightenment, which for 5 generic and a black is a 5/5 enchantment creature demon at uncommon. It's got flying, it gets -1/-1 for each card in your opponent's hands, and at the beginning of your upkeep, each player discards a card. This is a really interesting design, and the kind of card that's weird enough that I would say up front, this is a hard one to judge without playing with it, and I think if I'm going to be wrong about something, this is probably the card. But let's take a shot anyway. When you play him, he's probably going to be something like a 2/2, 3/3, or 4/4, and that's not that good for 6 mana. But he starts going after your opponent's hand on your upkeep, which will make it harder for them to keep him small. He makes you discard cards too, but you can sort of plan for that. By the time you play this guy, you can be in top deck mode. He'll eventually be quite large in most cases, and he provides some serious damage in the air when he gets big. The downside here is that opponents drawing cards in some cases could straight up kill him, and there will be times where you just can't play him because he's a 1/1 or something like that. Games just won't work out perfectly against a lot of opponents. This guy is, again, difficult to evaluate, but I feel like overall he will be pretty impactful when you play him, either at least claiming a few cards from your opponent's hand or, killing them. I think this card will be inconsistent, so I don't really feel like saying he's first pickable, but this is a weird enough card that it could be, again, completely off the mark here, but let's go with a C+. Next up, we have Erebos, Bleak-Hearted, who for 3 generic and a black is a 5/6 legendary enchantment creature god at Mythic Rare. He is indestructible. As long as your devotion to black is less than 5, he isn't a creature. Whenever another creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life if you do draw a card, and you can pay 1 generic and a black and sacrifice another creature, and target creature gets -2, -1 until end of turn. This seems great to me. Even if you never got to turn this into a creature, it would be a passable card, turning your creatures into removal spells while also drawing cards. That's a powerful effect, even if you can only kill small stuff with it. That ability also just wreaks havoc on combat constantly, because if you have mana up and creatures to spare, your opponent will have a very hard time deciding how to block effectively. And, the fact that any of your creatures dying in any way gives you the option to draw a card is great. This has the additional upside, of course, of turning into a creature, and its ability to draw you cards can actually assist you in achieving the necessary devotion, since you can dig for cards that help you get your devotion high enough. Erebos is just a straight bomb. A value engine, removal spell, and win condition all in one card is amazing, and that's what we have here. So yeah, he's an A. First pick him every time you see him. Next up, we have Erebos' Intervention, which for X generic mana and a black is a rare instant. Like all the interventions, it's a modal card. You have 2 choices. The first is target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. You gain X life. And the other is exile up to twice X target cards from graveyards. So this is great. It scales all game long as a removal spell and is capable of killing anything if the situation is right. Sometimes X-costed removal spells have the downside of making you tap out to kill one creature, which on some boards can just be dangerous, but the life gain this gives you helps make that less of a big deal. The fact that it's an instant is great too, because you can cast this whenever you need to, even if it's on your opponent's turn. You can use it to disrupt all kinds of things and get a lot of value out of it. The second mode, the ability to exile stuff from graveyards, will only be what you want to do on very rare occasions, as using the removal spell half of this will be the most useful 99% of the time, But again, the fact this is an instant means you can cast it in response to your opponent doing something with their graveyard, in which case you are actually claiming a card from your opponent, because whatever card they're using from their graveyard or to go into their graveyard will be gone. They'll have spent the mana on it, but they won't get the card anymore. Still, you're going to use a removal spell half of this, like 95% of the time, but it doesn't hurt that you can go after the graveyard if that's what you need. I think this is a bomb. I think you first pick it most of the time when you see it. It's an A-. Next up, we have Final Death, which for 4 generic and a black is a common instant that says exile target creature. It isn't fancy, but Final Death is a nice common removal spell for black. 5 mana to exile any creature at instant speed is nice, especially because, as we've said, this format loves the graveyard. Now, the question now is whether or not this is premium removal. Premium removal is the kind that does a very efficient job of killing creatures, to the point that you are usually coming out ahead in terms of mana. Final Death doesn't always do that because of its high mana cost, but the fact it's an instant does mean you can use it in response to stuff to get some big blowouts. It's also easily splashable. For me, I think it still falls a little short of premium territory, but not by a lot, and if this format ends up being extra grindy, and it may move up a little bit. For now though, I'm giving it a C+. You probably always play the first copy or two of this in black, but beyond that, you're probably hoping for something else. Next, it's Fruit of Tizoris, which is 1 black mana for a common sorcery. It says target player loses 2 life, and it has Escape. You can pay 3 generic and a black and exile 3 other cards from your graveyard to cast it from your graveyard. I don't like this. Cards that only have the ability to take life away from an opponent don't tend to be good in limited, since it isn't possible to get a critical mass of burn-type spells in most cases. This means that you often use a card like this to have no real impact on the game. Impacting the board is king in limited, and this doesn't do it. I get it, if you can mill yourself enough, you can cast this a bunch to slowly kill your opponent, but keeping the graveyard stocked enough for that to matter is going to be difficult, especially because it also wants 4 mana from you. And if this is what you're doing with your turn every turn, you're going to be really far behind your opponent. I think this might have a home in a black deck that is amazing at milling itself and really good at gaining control of the board, but outside of that, I think you should avoid this. I'm giving it a D-. Next up, we have Funeral Rites, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says you draw 2 cards, lose 2 life, and put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. Black gets these 3 mana, draw 2, lose 2 life cards all the time, and they tend to be solid and limited. This one comes with the added bonus of also milling your library, which, make no mistake, is upside in this format. Funeral Rites isn't the kind of card that pulls you into black, or even a card that you're particularly excited to play. It doesn't impact the board at all, and sometimes that's a liability. But at the same time, most black decks have room for one of these, and the first copy is usually something I want to have, giving it a C. Next up, we have Gravebreaker Lamia, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 enchantment creature, Snake Lamia at rare. It's got lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle your library, and spells you cast from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. So let's look at the basic card here. 5 mana for a 4/4 lifelinker is probably a C or C-. Lifelink is a nice keyword since it can swing the game wildly in your favor. Whenever this hits your opponent, the life swing is 8, which is just massive. Sure, it isn't incredibly efficient, but Gravebreaker Lamia makes up for this by letting you tutor up whatever you want to put into your graveyard, while also reducing the cast of cards you cast from your graveyard, which in this format mostly means cards with Escape, which will be now cheaper to cast. This means that a lot of the time, this will amount to a 5 mana 4/4 with lifelink that draws you a card, and that's pretty darn good. Ending up with a few cards that do something from the graveyard doesn't look like a challenge in this format either, so I don't think we have to go with a build around or anything here. I think Gravebreaker Lamia is just a B. You'll play it very happily and take it with early picks all the time. Next up, we have Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 2/4 zombie at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black, and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. This was a common last time, and it's a good thing they moved it to uncommon, because being at common probably would not have been great for the format, especially on Arena, where you'd be able to get like 5 of them with no problem at all. So, on a base level, the Merchant is a 5 mana 2/4 that drains the opponent for 2. That's not very good, and if that's all it was, that would probably be a D. However, I think once it is draining for 3, you're getting a decent amount of value for your mana, probably a C. If you're draining 4 or more, you're in serious business. I think the Merchant has a high enough ceiling that taking it with an early pick is a good idea. You may have to abandon it if your deck doesn't end up with enough black, but that's fine. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Grim Physician, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 zombie at common, and when it dies, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. We've seen this card a lot with different names. You know, it's a 1-drop that can potentially create a 2-for-1, and sure, it has to be a situation where your opponent has 2 X1s, but it will happen sometimes. It can also trade up with any X2 or just chump something and kill an X1. Grim Physician is not really a card you really want to have in your deck, and it is one that will often get cut, but it's serviceable. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Hateful Eidolon, which for 1 black mana is a 1/2 enchantment creature spirit and uncommon. It's got lifelink, and it says whenever an enchanted creature dies, draw a card for each aura you controlled that was attached to it. I think this is cool. A 1 mana 1/2 with lifelink is normally not a great card. People sometimes overrate 1-drops, but they are relevant on the board only very briefly and limited. That said, a 1 mana 1/2 with lifelink as a fail case isn't too bad. However, the ability it brings seems like it could just be straight gas. I always complain about getting 2-for-1 because of playing risky auras, and this Eidolon makes sure that won't be a problem because you draw a card anytime a creature with an aura on it that you control dies. Now, because of how this is worded, it doesn't only count your creatures when they die, it also counts your opponent's creatures. This means that if you play an enchantment that kills a creature, you also get to draw a card, at which point you're the one getting a 2-for-1. As we continue to look at black, we're going to see a few auras that can potentially kill creatures too, and at lower rarities, so it isn't far-fetched to imagine that happening. Keep in mind, by the way, if you try to cast an aura with Hateful Eidolon in play, and the creature you target is killed in response to that aura, you won't be drawing the card because it's never actually put on your creature. Still, this potentially seems like a 1-mana engine, and that's something I like a lot. It does require some setup, so I don't think I want to be first picking it. This is the kind of card I'm often wrong about because I go a little low on it because I think it will be harder to achieve the synergy than it is, so maybe it's higher than this, but for now I think it's a C+. Next up, we have Inevitable End, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature has, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. I don't love cards like this in most scenarios. Sure, if your opponent has 1 creature in play, it will feel like premium removal, but most of the time your opponent will have other creatures, including fairly expendable ones, and sometimes playing this card will basically be irrelevant, and that isn't what premium removal is supposed to do. Now, the flip side is that your opponent might try their hardest to keep their best creature alive and give up multiple creatures in an attempt to do so, and then the idea is they will have to sacrifice the creature you put this on after giving up a lot, but that isn't inevitable. That's just the best case scenario, and you won't get that very often. I don't think this is terrible, mind you, especially because this set loves enchantments, but it should not be taken early, and you should be running a bunch of black removal over it, giving it a C. Next up, we have Minions Return, which for 2 generic and a black is an enchantment aura. At uncommon, it's got flash and enchant creature, and it says whenever enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control. We've seen variants of this effect before, and they tend to be pretty bad. This is because your opponent can normally just play around the fact that you stuck this on their creature, and they can wait as long as they possibly can to give you that creature. And sometimes, if you actually get it, by the time you get it, it isn't really relevant anymore. The creature has to die after all, so this means you have to contribute both the reanimation aura and a way to kill the creature, which is a lot of resources. You can put it on your own creatures too, but oftentimes that effect is also pretty negligible. It is all just too situational. Minions Return interests me more than past versions of this effect though, and that's because it has flash. This means that you can put it on one of your creatures in response to removal, or on one of your opponents when they decide to block with it, and so on. Now, this type of card is still not something I love, because it's still super situational, but by adding flash to the mix, it is a little less situational, and a little more effective than past versions of this effect. I think I want to start it at C. Next up, we have Mire Triton, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 zombie merfolk at uncommon. It's got Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield, you put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, and you gain 2 life. I like this. A 2-mana 2/1 that can kill anything in combat thanks to Death Touch is usually going to be a C in most formats, but this brings some serious additional value, both gaining you life and helping you stock your graveyard. Self-mill is very useful in this format thanks to escape, and both the blue-black and green-black archetype also seem focused on loading up the graveyard. This seems like a great 2-drop for black decks in this format, one that I'm willing to take with a pretty early pick. I'm giving it a B-. Next, it's Mire's Grasp, which for 1 generic and a black is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets -3/-3. This is premium removal. 2 mana for -3/-3 is a good deal, and while I would normally prefer it to be an instant rather than an enchantment, the fact you can only cast it as a sorcery speed spell is made up for, at least a little bit, by having the useful enchantment type. It also doesn't hurt that you can put it on a large creature just to weaken it, or put it on something after combat and cause it to die. That's not ideal, mind you, but it is something additional this card can do. This is going to be one of Black's best commons, and something that I think you first pick pretty often, giving it a B. Next up, we have Mogus's Favor, which is 1 black mana for an enchantment aura at common with enchant creature. It says enchanted creature gets +2/-1. It has Escape for 2 generic and a black, which says exile 2 other cards from your graveyard. So I like designs on auras like these where a card can do 2 very different things. Auras that give a power boost and lower toughness are just wacky because you can potentially put them on one of your big creatures to make them hit even harder. Or you can put them on your opponent's X1 to kill it. That kind of flexibility is nice, and this comes with Escape, meaning you can sort of keep it around and then bring it back when you need it again, when either of those things I just mentioned seem attractive. The Escape here only asks for 2 cards, making it one of the easier ones to achieve. This seems like a solid aura to me. The first copy should usually make the cut. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Nightmare Shepherd, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 enchantment creature demon at rare. It's got flying, and it says whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a 1/1 and it's a nightmare in addition to its other types. This is a cool design and also incredibly powerful. 4 mana for a 4/4 flyer is already a B in limited, and this guy also brings the enchantment type to the table, which is mostly upside in this set. Then, the fact that any of your creatures dying gives you a 1/1 version of a creature who then gets exiled is pretty awesome. The exile part will sometimes be bad news because you want cards in your graveyard for various reasons, but it's still mostly upside. Getting a 1/1 token anytime one of your creature dies, and it's going to have other abilities most of the time, is pretty great. Now, the Shepherd doesn't include himself with the ability, nor does he include tokens, both of which make sense. If he included himself and tokens, he would just make a 1/1 copy when he died over and over again, and he would just make more 1/1s anytime one of your Nightmare tokens died. But yeah, this guy's very strong, and I think between his impressive base stats and his powerful ability, he's definitely a bomb. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Nyxborn Marauder, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 4/3 enchantment creature, and it's a Minotaur. This is probably the best of this cycle of vanilla enchantment creatures, and that's just because it's the most efficient. 4 mana 4/3s tend to be about a C-, and like the others, this is also an enchantment which can matter, so I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Omen of the Dead, which for 1 black mana is a common enchantment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. And for 2 generic and a black, you can sacrifice it and scry 2. 1 mana to get a creature back from your graveyard is a pretty decent rate, and it means leaving the mana up to flash this in at the end of your opponent's turn isn't going to be very much of a challenge. Like all of the omens, it can also scry late. Also, like the other omens, it's just a solid common for its color, giving it a C. Next up, it's Pharika's Libation, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says choose one. Target opponent sacrifices a creature, or target opponent sacrifices an enchantment. I don't really like edicts, and that continues to be true here. This one is at least modal, which means that you can choose whichever permanent type your opponent has fewer of, and if you're lucky, maybe they only have 1 really powerful enchantment or creature, and you get rid of their only 1. This is instant speed, giving you a little more flexibility as to when you can cast it, meaning you might be able to find a more advantageous situation. Cards like this are just so inconsistent. Yeah, if you cast this on turn 3 and your opponent loses their only creature, a 3-drop, you're doing alright. But what about when you cast it late and your opponent has a huge board? It doesn't feel so good. You'll include this in black decks when you don't get the better removal you're hoping for. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, we have Pharika's Spawn, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/4 Gorgon at uncommon. It has Escape. You can pay 5 generic and a black and exile 3 other cards from your graveyard to cast it from your graveyard, and it escapes with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and when it enters the battlefield this way, each opponent sacrifices a non-Gorgon creature. So a 4 mana 3/4 is usually a D+ these days, and that's what you have here at a base level. However, this comes with massive upside. If you can trade using that 3/4 body and then later in the game pay 6 and help this escape from your graveyard, you end up with a 5/6 body that has an edict effect. And when an edict effect is attached to a creature, it's a heck of a lot better. The spawn also asks for less cards to be exiled than a lot of cards with escape, so it doesn't require as much additional effort to load the graveyard as many of these do. So look, if this was just a 4 mana 3/4 that you could get back in the late game as a 6 mana 5/6, that would already be a pretty good card. This has been proven to us by mechanics like Embalm in the past. While neither side is efficient, the fact you get 2 creatures out of 1 card is some real value, and that's true of a lot of the escape creatures, and obviously enough, this has the additional upside of an Edict effect. I think all of that means this sneaks into the lower range of first pickable. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Rage Scarred Berserker, who for 4 generic and a black is a 5/4 Minotaur Berserker at common, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn. This is a pretty nice common. A 5 mana 5/4 is probably a D+, maybe a C-, but this enter the battlefield ability is no joke. In almost all situations, it will give you a free attack since your indestructible creature won't be able to die most of the time, and frequently it will enable an attack that you just couldn't have done otherwise. I really like the idea of this creature that brings a big body and also has an immediate impact on the board when he comes down. I think you always want to play the first copy of this. You may not want more than that in a lot of situations, as you can't have a ton of 5-drops. I think he is a C+, though. Next up, we have Scavenging Harpy, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/1 Harpy at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target card from an opponent's graveyard. 3 mana 2/1 flyers are pretty mediocre, probably a D+ or a C- in this day and age, something you avoid playing a lot of the time. It just doesn't have the greatest stats for the cost and dies to pretty much anything. This has some minor upside that will probably be a little less minor in this set, since it has the ability to exile a card from the graveyard, so taking something with Escape, for example, seems pretty nice. I think that additional ability is enough to pull the Harpy solidly up to C-. Next up, we have Soul Reaper of Mogis, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 enchantment creature, Minotaur Shaman at common, and you can pay 2 generic and a black, sacrifice a creature, and draw a card. This is a 3 mana 2/3 with relevant but unexciting upside, and that tends to be a C. The ideal thing to do with this is to sacrifice tokens or creatures who are no longer relevant, as well as those that are shut down by an enchantment, or those who become the target of removal spells. If you're desperate too, you can just pump a bunch of mana and creatures into this, trying to find your bomb or something. You won't always have the resources to use the ability, but it can come in handy. This is a solid common for black decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Temple Thief, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human rogue at common. It can't be blocked by enchanted creatures or enchantment creatures. This seems fine. There are a decent number of creatures in this format who won't be able to block it, but it isn't the majority or anything crazy. There will be enough games where it is nothing more than a 2 mana 2/2, and you could probably do better as far as 2-drops go, but you'll play this. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Treacherous Blessing, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards. Whenever you cast a spell, you lose 1 life, and whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability, you sacrifice it. I'm always a pretty big fan of Phyrexian Arena type cards, and that's what this reminds me of. 3 mana to draw 3 cards is incredibly strong and gives you the kind of card advantage that can just win you the game on its own. Sure, it comes with a significant downside, but I think that downside is almost always going to be worth it, as the cards that you net from this will often allow you to put your opponent away before the downside really matters. It's also nice that it gives you a bit of an escape clause, giving you a way to get rid of it if you have the right cards. I think this is good enough to be first pickable in weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next, we have Timurit Calls the Dead, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 and 2 both put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. Then you may exile a creature or enchantment card from your graveyard. If you do, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. And then his chapter 3 says you gain X life and scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. So the question with this card is, how often do you get 2 zombie tokens out of it? I feel like getting 1 with it is almost guaranteed, since it mills 3 cards on its own, and most decks will probably have like 18 enchantments and creatures combined, maybe even more. Getting 2 with it won't be as easy without at least a little bit of help, but it's also not crazy and far-fetched to think it'll happen. So how good is a 3 mana card for a 2/2 zombie that mills your library 6 cards and eventually lets you scry 1 and gain 1? Probably pretty good, honestly, and that's sort of the floor here. It will be better than that more often than not, especially because loading up your graveyard is so good. So with a very reasonable floor, extra synergy in the set, and an impressive ceiling, I think first picking Timurit Calls the Dead is a good idea, giving it a B. Next, we have Timurit, Chosen from Death, who is 2 black mana for a 2-star legendary enchantment creature, Demigod, at uncommon. His toughness is equal to your devotion to black, and he has an activated ability where you can pay 1 generic and a black to exile up to 2 cards from graveyards, and you gain 1 life for each creature card exiled this way. So, at worst, Timurit is a 2-mana 2-2 with a useful but unexciting activated ability. The ability to go after your opponent's graveyard matters more than normal in this set, of course, and gaining life, while not that exciting, doesn't hurt either. Obviously, Timurit's toughness can increase as your devotion goes up, making him a solid blocker. Overall, Timurit isn't anything special, and I think he's an okay card for black decks. Maybe Graveyard Hate ends up being better than I'm expecting, but for now, I'm giving him a C+. Next up is Underworld Charger, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/3 Nightmare Horse at common. It can't block, it can escape. You can pay 4 generic and a black and exile 3 other cards from your graveyard to cast it from your graveyard, and if it escapes, it comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. As an escape creature who can't block, it will sometimes be harder to trade with this than some of the others. However, because of its efficiency as a 3-mana 3/3, your opponent will often find themselves having to trade with it to avoid taking damage. The fact that this can come back over and over, and as a 5/5, means that it can represent a pretty resilient threat, even if all it can do is turn sideways. But a 5/5 is relevant even in the late game. I think this seems like a pretty ideal 3-drop for black aggro decks in this format. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Underworld Dreams, which is 3 black mana for an uncommon enchantment, and whenever an opponent draws a card, it deals 1 damage to that player. This is a very old Magic card, and it makes good sense that it was reprinted here, both because of the flavor, and because it's an enchantment, which this set cares about, and because it's good with devotion. It provides you with some inevitability, since it punishes opponents every time they draw a card, something they have to be doing at least once a turn. However, it's a 3-mana enchantment that has no immediate impact, and that is certainly a liability. I think you're only going to be playing this in control decks that are in need of a win condition, or in decks really interested in black devotion. In those decks it'll be fine, but I don't imagine it being something to be excited about. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Venomous Hierophant, who for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 Gorgon Cleric at common. It's got Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield, you put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. Death Touch is a funny mechanic because unlike most keywords, the bigger the creature gets, the less kind of relevant that keyword gets. As a 4-mana 3/3, the fact that this can trade for anything isn't quite as attractive as it can be on a cheaper creature. That said, it certainly isn't a downside, it just doesn't provide super impressive upside either. I like that this also mills the top 3 cards of your library. In fact, that's where you're going to get a lot of value from, because as we've seen, graveyards are important in this format, and this does a good job of helping you get enough cards in there for escape and various other synergies. This is a solid playable for black, though I kind of think you're probably not going to feel great about playing more than 1 copy of it. Giving it a C. Our last black card is Woe Strider, who for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 horror at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/1 white goat creature token. You can sacrifice another creature to scry 1. He can escape if you pay 3 generic and 2 black and exile 4 other cards from your graveyard. And when it escapes, you get 2 +1/+1 counters on Woe Strider. So a 3-mana 3/2 that makes a 0/1 when it comes into play is probably a C or C+. Then you have the Scry clause, and I think you move into the B- territory. But then, this also has Escape, and it comes back as a big boy, and I think that all of that combined means you easily get 2-for-1s with this, while also improving your draws as needed. Having a free sacrifice outlet is also often sneakily powerful too, so keep an eye out for other synergies. It isn't like this is a creature that takes over the game, but it is definitely a creature that can help you turn the tide and stabilize, or pull ahead of your opponent. The fact you can bring it back numerous times in some situations is amazing. It isn't quite a bomb, but it's close. You'll first pick it most of the time, giving it a B+. So, those are all the black cards in Theros Beyond Death. Tomorrow, I'll be back to talk about all the red cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this series, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on this series, you should find a link to the playlist in the description below. And if there's anything you think I got wrong, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.